Thank you, Steen.
Okay, so can you see my my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen. Maybe you just want to have it in presentation mode, but yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I just want to mention that this has mainly been done by Morten, one of my now graduate students, and there is some new material that was not in our paper we submitted, and Michael Peterson has been participating in developing that. So I was asked to give a little bit of a background for our modeling, and I'll just say that we had a national-wide lockdown declared in March 11 in 2020, and it took a little about 5 days or so before the whole country was under lockdown. And in the following weeks, we established an independent pandemic modeling group as a collaboration between my university, State Serum Institute, which is a National Institute of Health, and Rigshospitalet, which is our national university hospital. And in the beginning, we did an agent-based pandemic modeling, where we actually had the individual nodes represented as random graphs. But as time passed on, we realized that there was no disaggregated data available at that time. So we had to let this approach go, and then we used a more aggregated approach where we could compare our modeling and simulation efforts with the actual observed incidences and so forth. And I just want to say one more thing, that in the beginning we thought that it'll be sort of a national effort where the scientific community got together. But no, that was not the case. The government established a closed group where all the scientists, they got gag orders, and that meant they were not allowed to communicate with the external scientific community. And I'll get back to why that I don't know why that happened. Well, I think I know, but I'll get back to this later because there is an interesting afterplay. So we were several groups that did independent work, and we were one of them. And then the government had a small group that was under their control. We ended up using a serious pandemic and simple healthcare model. And you can see a picture of it here, where it's a box model where we have the susceptible out in the left area here. Can you see the pointer? These are the susceptibles. Here we have the incubated. They can either then turn out to be asymptomatic or symptomatic. And we divide symptomatic and asymptomatic as you are symptomatic if you have fever. If you don't have fever, you will be considered asymptomatic. Turns out that if you make an average across the population, about for every one symptomatic, there'll be about 5 or actually 5.2 asymptomatics. And we have two different recovery groups because there is some discussion about whether you are, depending on how badly hit you were by the virus, you might have different immune memory. Now, it is only the symptomatic that goes to the hospital, or some of them might become terminally ill, so they'll get into this box M where they will eventually die, or they'll get into the hospital. Some will be so bad that they'll immediately get into the ICU units, but typically they'll go to the hospital, and then there is an exchange between the hospital and ICU units, where some people unfortunately will die, whereas most of them will recover and come up in this box up here. We have not included vaccination because we stopped our analysis when about 3% of the population was vaccinated. You can see some of the references to our work. We have published some of it, and some of it is out on the meta archives, and we have a new paper on our way here. The model, I don't want to go through all the equations, but again, you can look into our paper, but I want to emphasize one thing, that when you make such a simple model, there's still lots of parameters. And we have 19 parameters in our model, and as many of you know, that works with mathematical modeling. That means that you can pretty much get anything out of it. I should say though that most of these parameters, they are either empirically determined, or we know about what's going on because of clinical studies, or and the rest of them, they are bound data. So we have, since the onset of the pandemic, had access to hospital data, which is the red curve, and ICU data, which is the orange curve, as well as death data. I mean, how many people has died. You have the population size out on the left-hand side. So these data has been available. Of course, they were coming every day, a couple of days delayed. And then we, later on in the process, we also got access to antibody data, where there's some of them are made from a population average, and some of them are actually made from the blood bank. So people who has actually been delivering blood, they've made this standard test on how many of them had antibodies. Now, for us to tune this model to actually generate the kind of dynamics that we see, we have to make this policy model. And the policy model is, if you look at the time on the x-axis, then we have 3 different types of infections infecting the population. The incubating part of the population is infected the last day and a half on average. Both the asymptomatic and the symptomatic are infective all the way through their disease. And they are usually, or the average disease time or infection time is about 10 days. You are incubated for about 5 days on average. So this profile is what we have to adjust to make sure that we get the same kind of dynamics as we actually see. And we take into account a policy lockdown open up factor, and then we also have to take into account a mutation change, because the British mutant came in here around Christmas time, and became dominant, almost dominant, by early March when we stopped this. We stopped our analysis. Note also that our R0, the infectiousness of the pandemic, is between 5 and 6, and that's because we are also including the incubated and the asymptomatic, whereas most other people, they only look at the ones that they've actually identified, but we look at the ones that we believe are infected. That gives a higher R0. I don't know why it doesn't want to do that. Okay, so here we have compared the reported and simulated, and you see that it fits quite well. We had to make some decisions about age distribution for symptomatic and asymptomatic, and also whether the immune memory was different, whether we should have to differentiate between whether you've been hard hit or only mildly hit by the disease. Long story short, it doesn't really matter. If we have if we assume that the immune memory is about 250 days, then we get this curve here, and we get pretty much the same curve if we take these things into account. We also get a very nice fit for the hospital and death data. And one thing we had to do, we had to make minor adjustments in the healthcare model, because the treatment was improved over time. So that was one thing, and also the death of, in particular, the people at elder care facilities depended on the death rate depended on how how high the national infection level is. So we have to adjust these things. But else you see, we get these things. All other parameters are constant. So the next thing, one of the other things we wanted to do is try to figure out how well is this infection tracing actually being conducted in Denmark. And the daily infected is identified as these orange dots. You should note that there is a very different, there's a large difference between the different scales here. So these are actually how many are being identified over time. And we start in July. We had another wave earlier on, but there wasn't any infection detection capability built up until the summer here. So then we try to understand how can we compare how much is actually being identified compared to how much is out there, how many is infected and how many are being caught in and actually being isolated and taken care of. So we have different, we're measuring different things, and these are out from the simulations because these are non-observable entities. You look at the black curve. The black curve is simply the sum of all the different infected. If you look at the dark blue curve, it is the rate out of the incubated. It means that how many are coming into becoming either asymptomatic or symptomatic. And the other one, the light blue, is actually how many are being infected. These are the ones that are coming into the incubated. And it's to get an idea of how these the infected, the identified actually is located compared to the rest of the to the simulated system. Because again, we love to know the real numbers, but we don't have access to these real numbers. So then there's a question of how we can estimate the effectiveness of this or efficiency of the national infection tracing. I mean, the efficiency must be defined in one way as another as the number of detected over the actually infected. And I'm not going through this in too much detail. I'll just say that if we have this daily detection rate, we have these observed data, they come in every day. And then if we assume that if we have a positive diagnosis, the day they become infected, that means the day they actually go out of the incubated box, then we can define this DT max, which is given by the infected divided by, given by the observed divided by the actual infected. Now, you could also assume that the identification of whether you're infected or not happens at the very last day that you can actually be, where you can infect somebody. And then you get, so to say, the DT mean here, mine, and since I only have 2 minutes left, you can imagine that you can, or not imagine, you can directly see that you can then, instead of looking at what comes in, but what comes out of the infected population, you get a much lower identification efficiency. And in this calculation, we assume that every symptomatic individual has become, is being, observed, and whereas it's not so with the incubated and the asymptomatic. And since we don't have detailed information about at which point in the infection that these people are being identified, we just take the maximum entropy estimate. That means the average of the two. If we do that, then we get these curves here, where you have the different rates. We compare the different rates with each other. And if you look at the DT minimum and the DT maximum, the minimum is yellow and the maximum is orange. And then we have this average, which is the blue line. So you can see that there are periods where there has been nice efficiency. This is a high efficiency. Actually, we come up above 100% with compared to the incubated. And that's simply because there was a local outbreak in a city called Aarhus, where they put all the resources in there. They did a very good job in terms of stopping the infection. Whereas as you go along the line, many things could be said about that. I just noted that when we get to just around Christmas, the efficiency is very, very bad. It's below, it's maybe 10 or 15% or something like that. This is when we had the second wave. Now, one of the things I want to say is that we contacted the Styrelsen for, I can't see because of this bar up here. I can move the bar. Styrelsen for Patientsikkerhed, this is a national infection tracing authority in August, to tell them that Denmark was not in any position to deal with a likely second wave that would come once winter was hitting. But they refused to interact with us at this time. We just thought that it was bad communication. But in the end, we were forced to ask for public access to documents to simply figure out what the heck they were doing, because nobody was allowed to figure out what they were doing. So then as we published our results, we actually made the front page of the main Danish newspaper, Berlingske Tidende, 3 times, where the publisher of the newspaper asks STPS, I mean the authority for infection tracing, to be responsible and tell the scientists what the heck they're doing. So it's really funny. I still do that every 14 days for months and months. I've received an official email from the organization STPS with the rejection of public access to documents. So we're in a situation where the Danish institutions and government refuse to interact with people that can help them. I think that's pretty interesting. So let me just sum up here. So we have constructed a simple simulation of the Danish pandemic and the Danish healthcare system. We have shown that the pandemic is mainly driven by incubated and asymptomatic infected. For every asymptomatic individual, we have about 5 asymptomatic. We can estimate the pandemic impact on the healthcare system. We have also previously, this was used in the government, in the parliament. We developed scenarios for the winter wave in 2020, 2021. It's not part of this story, it's already published. And then we can use the simulation to estimate population immunity memories, as well as infection tracing efficiencies, which are unfortunately not very high. But I have a question we could maybe discuss. What the heck is the scientific community? What are we supposed to do when the Danish institution, I've done this in the US, both after 9/11, and we had big forest fires when I was working at Los Alamos. As scientists, we were welcomed to help the institutions that were responsible, and we were given resources and we were integrated in this. But apparently, Denmark has a completely different tradition. So we have been told to shut up and go home. So that's why we didn't continue the work here and included the vaccinations and so forth, because it seems like nobody cared. Thank you.
Thank you, Steen. Thank you for such an interesting presentation. Well, we have a couple of minutes for one question, perhaps. Maybe someone wants.
I have a question.
Hiroki, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm the next speaker, so I can ask questions. So thank you very much, Steen. So I wonder if your data contain the spatial dimension. So have you considered including the spatial heterogeneity within the country in your model?
Yes, we did, but that was what we started out with an agent-based model that was also geographically distributed. But at that time, there was no data. So then the data became available some months later. But then we were already picked a modeling approach, and we were getting good results, and so we decided to just stick with it, and then we just did a national model. So the government's expert group has actually developed this. So over the summer and the fall, they actually got a model up and running where you have the different regions where you can see that.
Yep. Thank you.